Greetings. Welcome to CHSF 2107, the best class online. At least the coolest students. Alright, let's get into this. We're going to be doing chapter 11, looking at middle adulthood and some of the social and emotional aspects of development. And I hope you're having a good week. I hope things are going okay in your life. Grab a hot drink or whatever, and let's get into it. Alright. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about today is how Erickson had this idea that at each stage in life you're going through these different key developmental steps, right? And early in the course we talked about the idea of how the child's trying to establish trust, right? And then trying to establish initiative and autonomy and industry, and then as the teenager's trying to establish identity, and then as a young adult trying to establish intimacy, right? And the last assignment dealt with that. And then as you get into this middle age, right, like yours truly, Erickson has this idea that what becomes developmentally important to you is, do you feel like you're generating or creating any impact that actually matters on the next generation, or are you just, kind of yelling into the wind? And that's an old saying, but basically just means like no one's listening. It's like one of the ideas of Erickson is that as you get into this middle age period, questions about, is there any value and meaning to what I'm doing, and like, am I having any kind of effect on the next generation, and on, whether it's through whether through like parenting or mentoring or teaching or taking leadership roles at a community level in whatever way, that what's important is that people feel like this gets really existential. It's an existential level concern. Like, does my life matter? Am I doing something, or am I like wasting my time, right? That's the alternative, that I'm stagnating. I'm going to do that on the next slide. But because remember, all of Erickson's ideas come as a bit of a warning that you don't have an option. You either develop this aspect of self, or you run the risk of the flip of the coin, right? Which is not feeling like you're contributing anything, not feeling like you're living a life that is generating meaningful experience, right? Notice the word generativity, notice the word generation, generation, I didn't even mean to really say that, I meant to say generate, right? To generate something, or even like how to generate a line of family is a generation, right? It's all kind of a similar word, that you're invested in, you have interest in establishing and guiding the next generation. And again, remember what we're talking about. He's saying that his view of social psychological, or like he calls it psychosocial, but basically just that the idea that the mind evolves through this complicated interaction with your social world, and that at the different stages that you're at age-wise, you're confronting different main challenges or crises. And the one that you're dealing with when you're me is, you're putting colored lights behind you because you're trying to make you're trying to be meaningful, real, authentic. It's like, and the risk is that if you don't have that, you run the risk of stagnation. Okay, so yeah, I rewatched that slide, and I threw in a couple points that I didn't finish on the last one. I referenced the light or whatever, and as if it's like a sign of going through a midlife crisis, trying to look cool to the students. I got a light that changes colors. Come on, everyone. But no, we are going to talk about this idea today of like the obvious idea of the midlife crisis, right? Like, what does it mean to get to this kind of middle life, right? Like the middle of your life, and just to be like, I'm 41, right? And what does it mean to be 41 and being looking back and being like, looking at the life you've lived, looking at what's coming next, looking at what you're trying to do with things, and kind of assessing if you've stalled, if you've stagnated, right? And I use the picture that body of water that looks very stagnant. There's nothing flowing in, nothing flowing out. It's dead. Failure can lead to this pervading, like all-encompassing sense of personal impoverishment, right? And think of what that means. That's like speaking at a psychological level. That's like the idea of what it feels like when you don't feel like you're contributing anything. You don't feel like what you're doing matters, and that's like a rough realization to have, right? That you're not being who you want to be. And then you could see how like a midlife crisis all of a sudden like makes sense. That's like a kind of reasonable reaction to an existential crisis around who am I, what am I doing, and who cares? And is it actually meaningful and grounded in something that's real? My mind rebels at stagnation. Give me problems, give me work, give me the most abstruse cryptogram, which is like a puzzle where like a certain number means or a certain letter means a certain number, or a certain number means a certain letter, and it's like think Sherlock Holmes. This is the guy that wrote Sherlock Holmes. Give me the most abstruse cryptogram or the most intricate analysis, like just basically saying like give me something like hard to work on. I'm in my own proper atmosphere. So he's basically saying like he's in a zone or in a flow state. Give me something to challenge my capacities, especially intellectually. But I abhor the dull routine of existence. I crave for mental exaltation. It's a pretty good quote, right? And he's kind of making this point that like it's an anti-stagnation point. It's a point of like feeling like you're doing something that matters and you're trying, and you've heard me rant about this idea before that humans are target-based creatures. Like everything about our vision and how we focus and how we target things and how we have goals, it's all, our language is very visual, where we work best and our dopamine system is most, well, rewards and responds to us when we're moving towards goals that are meaningful, right? And it's in some ways moving towards a goal that you've deemed meaningful is as rewarding of a thing it's as rewarding of an experience almost as possible for your brain. It's like your brain's targeted in on something that it's deemed meaningful. I've said this, if you're playing word bingo, I've used the word meaningful like 100 times today, but this is going to be kind of the point, that this is a philosophical state, right? I'm trying to explain a bit this concept of midlife crisis and kind of tie like my own thoughts with the concept, right? That the concept makes sense. The concept's basically that you're at the halfway point, and you all know that, but that once you're there, there's a psychology associated with that, and the psychology associated with that is you're not 20 anymore. You don't have the same repertoire of potential life choices in front of you. If you've made commitments in certain areas, you have obligations in certain areas, certain plans that you had years ago are now at a level of having played out. So all this stuff's like happening at the same time, and now you're like reflecting on it, and again, stagnation is the enemy, right? One of my points I'm coming back to over and over again in these courses is that like real human relationship, real human curiosity and creativity and humanity expressed through like you actually finding things that you're interested in and you speaking the truth and you having relationships with people that are actually deep. It's like that's what sustains you. That's what sustains your mental health. It's like you're not going to have, I don't know. Maybe I should move to the next slide. Okay, here we go. So, okay, this point's a little bit interesting, that if you ask men early in their life, like when they're around 20, if they want to have kids and if that's an important thing to them, and some will say yes, some will say no, then you reconnect with those kids later, like it says there, like when they're like, say 47 is the study that I'm referencing, and see if they have kids or not. And what's interesting is you see that there's a connection if there's a mismatch, right? So like for people that because this says like what's the impact of childlessness for people that had said that they wanted to have kids and then they don't and they're 47, that that well that weighs on them, right? And that they get to that point where they're like, well, it's predictive of psychological health, right? Predictive of, and just think about it. I want to keep, at risk of being repetitive, kind of over make this point that it's this combination of being in this reflective state, looking at your life, and also being very conscious of the fact that there's no do-over, there's no restart, that you're kind of, although you can change certain patterns or whatever in your life, you can't start the life over again, right? So it's interesting because it's almost like, well, and we know that fatherhood is important and has a huge impact on men, right? That second point, we know that raising your own kid or raising another person's child, if it's an adopted situation or whatever, can call forth certain nurturing qualities in people, right? And that, and like I can certainly speak to that, like having two daughters myself, like it's certainly changed. I should put that like that. It's certainly changed and challenged me and like forced me to develop or evolve who I am in certain ways, like having two little girls and just the need for patience, or even just the fact there's a huge break between the slides. Like I'm on slide 5 now. I did slide 4. Between slide 4 and 5, I just had to try to get my daughter back to sleep. So it's like, but again, she was like being cute, and it's like I wouldn't trade that stuff for the world. So it's like there's parts of me that are associated with being a dad that I wouldn't even know I was missing if I didn't have, because it's like they were emergent qualities, right? Or it's like they were brought forth. Okay. Okay, so this is a pretty interesting idea, and this comes from the work of someone last name Valant, right? And this is a person that's kind of looking at Erickson's model and looking at this generativity stage and saying like maybe it would make sense to break it into two substages or two sections. Basically, it's going to be like one related to work and one related to family. And he's saying that like at this stage there's this, well, you're kind of in this career consolidation mode, and I guess I that would be relevant and make sense for me. Like I'm not brand new at my job. I'm like relatively new to teaching at Nipissing, but I've been teaching at Conestoga for like whatever 12 years or something now, and it's like I'm 41, like I said, and I'm not brand new, but I'm also not at like retirement age yet, right? I'm kind of in mid career, and create a new social network with like your work friends and stuff. It's like I guess that was pre-pandemic, but like I don't know. Well, there's like, because I found like with Nipsing, it's been interesting. Like I've really enjoyed. It's weird how it worked. It's weird how I kind of started working there at the beginning of the pandemic, but over the pandemic, I've gotten a lot of enjoyment in a lot of ways out of interacting with all you North Bay students and from North Bay and surrounding areas. It's like, oh, it's been a blessing in a lot of ways. So that'd be like a positive example of a new social network for sure, right? And something that is enjoyable. Like it's like sometimes when there's like tons of pressure to get marks in or tons of pressure to like get something recorded and in by a certain time or whatever, like there can obviously be stresses and stuff associated with academic stuff, but from my heart of hearts, it's like I do enjoy doing this, right? It's like I like talking about, it's like I like talking about especially this kind of stuff, and maybe sharing it with you. So anyways, blah blah blah. Basically, I'm just making this point that there's an aspect of this generative stage. You could kind of subdivide it according to Vallant's work into the career consolidation, which is one aspect, basically starting to really establish yourself work wise. And then I'll show you the next aspect on the next slide. And so another one that he says, this idea, the second one, right? So if the first one is the career consolidation around work, the second one's around family, and you can interpret family both like very specifically to your immediate family. This is a picture of me and my mother-in-law in the water uh, at Algonquin Park, or no, that's at Kilbear Park, and I think I had this here because like she's a good example of someone that's a keeper of meaning, someone that's like ever since I met my wife, her mother's like somebody that organizes a lot of the get-togethers and like shares a lot of stories about how things were and stuff like that. And it's like even say for example me talking about my program at Conestoga where I've been like in that program now for quite a while and I've seen people come and go and I've seen hundreds and hundreds of students move through it and so I can sort of speak a bit to some of the organizational history or family history in a different sense. And it's that idea of like being a keeper of meaning so that there's like some tradition that passes, right? That there's that to preserve values and institutions to benefit further generations, I say on the slide, right? Which is like a kind of drier way of saying it, but that's actually a pretty clear way of saying it. You're trying to keep meaning for next generations. Here's just a picture. I just threw a couple pictures in this presentation. My wife's in the green shirt closest to you, and that's her extended family. The good-looking guy holding the orange plate, if you're wondering, is yours truly. Not my most flattering picture, but just this idea of, you know, like I was mentioning on the last slide, like to my mother-in-law, these getting everyone together, camping, telling stories around the fire, whatever, having these big meals together. It's like it's an important part of preserving aspects of, tradition and culture and family. Okay, so Levinston and Erickson. Levinson's another developmental psychologist looking at this idea of midlife crisis and looking at this idea of if it's an actual thing, right? Like you've heard the idea of midlife crisis probably a million times in like movies and TV shows and stuff like that, but is there actually like something that we can find and measure and see as like developmentally relatively common for humans? And it's like one thing I would say to that is I think that reflective period is very normal. It's not like people hit 40 and have like a predictable response or hit 50 and have a predictable response, but the idea is that as you're getting older, you eventually kind of get hit with this, I say there, constellation. Think of like the constellation of stars, like huge group of things, like a group of situations, right? Like one of the things is you start to get aware that you're not going to be around forever. Sorry, I have like a back and forth sway. It's from like holding the baby so much. It's like I noticed I was getting my health card updated and I was in like line and I'm like, I almost can't help it. So I just caught myself in camera doing that. So I'll try to keep it in control a bit. But yeah, you start to become aware of your own mortality. And sometimes that's because of losing people around you that you weren't considering, you hadn't considered the potential of losing, and then having to deal with that kind of level of realization. Or sometimes it's about health things that come up and then force you to kind of reconsider and deal with this fact that we're not going to be on this planet forever, like we're not going to be alive forever, the mortality idea, and that sometimes there might be like physical limitations, right? If you've been hurt or if you've been injured or in certain health conditions, and then like adapting to other, I say there are major changes in other roles, right? So that could be like going through something like a divorce or losing a parent or losing a child, God forbid, or like going through, I already said like health issues or some kind of like personal tragedy, or at the other end like some kind of, really the idea is things that make you like really question and look at where you are, what you're doing, plus this secondary idea of the not having like a second go at it or a second try or being time sensitive, that your situation is time sensitive, right? You're not going to be alive forever. It's not, there's a finite aspect to mortality that we all know, but that knowing it and feeling it are completely different. So the research on it's kind of interesting, right? Like it kind of comes down to this point that I was hinting at on the last slide, that if you try to say like is a midlife crisis like a specific thing that has like a specific trigger that's like um, either biological or social, it's like, well, it's not that like perfect of an idea, but what you can find is about a quarter of people report having like some significant period of deep reflection that they would personally label as like a midlife crisis, right? And it's usually based on some of those things that we're saying. But the key idea I want you to have for your notes is that this is more likely going to be triggered by something that's like a life event, right? Rather than like specific age. And you all know that, right? It's not like it's like specifically related to being 45 or 40 or 50 or 60 or whatever. It's about that idea of like, what becoming conscious of your mortality and maybe like starting to deal with some health issues and maybe losing someone, and this idea of the sands of time or whatever you want to say, and that sometimes it's related to physical challenges. And then I make this point that the variation in optimism has a huge effect on how you construct your story. Like one example, and this is she was older, but I always remember my grandma. It's like she'd be like, "Oh, my my creaky old bones," and she always had like a way of just almost like laughing at her pain. And I'm sure she experienced it, but she didn't let it hold her back. And it's like that actually how and people are understanding this more and more, how your mindset affects your actual physical health. Whether you're looking at someone like the great Viktor Frankl and his work on how, how basically hope and the belief in the potential in humanity and just like having meaning and purpose can actually affect like the immune system, can actually like affect actual longevity of people, right? And that's Man's Search for Meaning, like maybe the most important psychology book ever written in some ways. And so there's like that kind of idea, but you could also look up people like Bruce Lipton or there's a book called The Balance Within. What's the person's last name? It's slipping me at the time, but it's like about the neuroscience of belief. I think that's the subtitle or something like that. If you're interested, what I just said would get you like close enough in a Google search that you'd find the book. But it's this interesting idea that actually, and it makes sense. It's like being negative about everything. It's not just that like the negative attitude or the positive attitude necessarily, like it's not just that it affects your immune system in that sense of like having purpose or not having purpose. It's also that if you're negative all the time and like what kind of you have cortisol going through your blood all the time, it's like we know that like stress is hard on the brain, and part of the reason is because of the increase in cortisol. And it's like, okay, so what's the long-term consequence of being like in a negative headspace for a super long period of time? It's actually a kind of interesting thought, right? That, and when I say optimism, I mean it in like the deepest way. I don't mean like a fake, naive, like almost innocent optimism. It's like at this point we're talking about the fact that you might have been through some stuff. You might have had some plans not work out or not maybe necessarily go the way that you wanted, but like it's like kind of the bigger picture. It's like not every day is perfect, but in general things are like moving in the right direction, and how you make sense of your story matters, right? Like how you make sense of, because what do I mean by story? Like your life. So the next thing I want to talk about is how the roles in your life are, constantly transitioning. And in psychology, sometimes this word role, I've kind of explained it in different contexts to you already, but the idea of, I like to just say it as like, imagine you're playing like a role in different movies, and the different roles you're playing are sometimes like, for myself, for example, right now I'm maybe playing the role of like a teacher or a professor or a lecturer, I guess I'm called at Nipsing, and like or at the college, and then when I'm around my kids, I'm obviously playing the role of like the dad, and then I'm playing the role of the husband, and then I'm playing the role of like the kid to my parents, and the role of like the sibling to my brother and sister, and the role of like friend to my buddies and stuff, right? And it's like those are all different roles, and sometimes we feel strained because of the roles competing, and that's what we're going to talk about on the next slide. But sometimes we feel the strain from within one of the roles, right? So like an example of that that would be easy for you to understand is obviously like when your school semesters get more intense, and all of a sudden everything's like, well, the stress of school kind of creates like a role strain when the stress that occurs within a person feels like they like lack the stress that occurs when a person feels like they lack the resources needed to successfully fulfill a role, right? So it's like oftentimes the resources needed are like time and energy, right? You don't have the time and energy to do all the things that you need to do. It's like that person trying to run around with like octopus arms. It's like you don't have enough time in the day. A middle life adult might return to college to learn new work skills, like, and the stress of the situation. I think I just have that as like an example, right? That like that'd be an example of maybe, well, basically the point here is sometimes what it can be is like the actual situation, or maybe it's like you're a new parent, right? And it's that adjustment aspect, right? Or maybe it's, okay, so this is role strain. So I'm going to contrast it to role conflict in a second. And I keep like almost describing that because it's hard to keep them different, because they're basically similar things, right? And oftentimes people are dealing with both. But sometimes the conceptual distinction is, sometimes what's kind of stressing you is that you have to do a million things at once, which is going to be role conflict. And then sometimes it's that one of them, things that you're doing, is really overbearing at certain times, right? And maybe it's that like, yeah, like school or work usually are the ones for that. Okay, so again, I'm going to contrast it now with role conflict. So if you're to be asked on a question, like to distinguish the two, right? The basic conceptual idea you're thinking of is this question suggesting that the person is being overwhelmed by like one aspect of their life, which we'd usually call a role strain, or is it more by the interaction of the aspects of their life, right? Like, is it role conflict? A classic example would be like, say I'm trying to do my job as like a teacher, but then my kid's sick and they're home from school, and I'm trying to like take care of them too. And so it's like a conflict almost between my responsibilities as a parent and my responsibilities as a teacher, right? And it's like, so there, what I need to do as the teacher might not be even that super hard, and what I need to do as the parent might not even be that super hard if they weren't both being demanded at the same time, right? It could be something I'm actually not overly strained within the individual roles, but I'm being strained by the kind of collective combination or the cumulative effect of all my roles. Any situation in which two or more roles are at least partially incompatible, right? That, well, it's hard to like take care of your kid and be a totally alert parent and engaged when you're also working from home. And that's like been something that lots of parents can relate to over the last few years, especially. Okay, I think you get the point, right? So just keep in mind this idea, and I know I'm being a bit rambly, but keep in mind this idea that if you're to be asked the difference, it's just, is it one single thing that's overwhelming, or is it the combo effect? So I say there are changes in relationships like partnership, and this is kind of looking at, well, it's kind of related to this idea of looking at marital satisfaction patterns and how it relates to having kids and stuff. And what you tend to see is marital satisfaction goes up as you get into midlife. And I have there some of the reasons, and a lot of them are ones that would make sense, right? Like if you had kids, and obviously not every couple has kids, but the ones that do tend to be, well, your kids are maybe a little bit older, right? And like maybe they're starting to, because really like one of the hardest things, and I know that kids are, there's difficulties at every stage, right? And it's not like having teenagers is super easy, or having like kids in grade 7 is like super easy or something, because when they're teenagers that's hard for a whole different reason. And when they're like at that other age, grade 7 or whatever I said, it's like that's when it's like activities every night and all that kind of stuff. But then there's like a unique struggle about when they're kind of like under 2, right? And they're so, the attention need is constant. And it's like once they're a bit older, and like especially if you can restabilize your sleep, it's like there can be some balance a little bit more. Marital stability, satisfaction increases. And remember, this links to like something I was saying earlier, is like if you can last to year 8 in marriage, the likelihood of divorce drops big time statistically. More because of like having, like I say, increased sense of control, but like having some of your schedule back, basically, from maybe not having kids as young. And then I say there, like, this is a good word, skilled diplomacy. It basically means like one of the reasons marital satisfaction tends to go up is because as you get older, and if you've been with someone for a while, hopefully you're getting better and better at working through the situations that you need to work through, right? Skilled diplomacy. What's a diplomat? Somebody that's like representing this country, and then there's a diplomat from the other country, and they get together and they talk, and they're representing positions. And it's a weird way to talk about like you and your spouse, or you and your boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever. But the idea is like, well, okay, you know what things you could say to go down the argument path again, or you know what you could say to like maybe pour some cold water on the or like kind of calm things down, or you know, you start to learn each other, and you start to learn how to interact with each other. Skilled diplomacy. And it kind of gets to that idea of like how you handle conflict and how you handle those kind of situations. And nobody's perfect, and it's not like I'm perfect, but those become, it's almost like the better you get at handling the harder days, the more it kind of smooths things out and makes the enjoyable days better. I don't know, that almost, I tried to turn that into like a quote or something, but basically just this idea of skilled diplomacy. You get better at understanding each other, living with each other, communicating. Some of it's verbal, but some of it's obviously nonverbal, and like in relation to things like respect, and like understanding that some people sometimes want to be heard, sometimes people want advice related to problem solving, sometimes people want, you know, the sense of belonging, and those are all kind of related to successful problem solving strategies. Okay, I'm gonna segue to the next slide. Got a bit rambly there. I love yous. Hope you're still with me. Next slide. So here's another concept for you of the sandwich generation. And I think it captures it with this guy. With, you can kind of picture it as maybe it's his dad in a wheelchair on this side because he's older, and then he's got his kid in the stroller, right? And it's kind of representing this idea that he's at a stage in life where he's providing care in both directions. Right? In middle adulthood, the family role involves often giving assistance in both directions of the generational chain. Right? So now think of what that means. And sometimes that means time, sometimes that means energy, sometimes that means money. And so it's like, you know, my parents, knock on wood, and thankfully are pretty healthy right now. But in the future, if they were dealing with health stuff and I'm like helping them, and I still have kids myself, and it's like feeling the pull to support in both directions, and it's like you're sandwiched in the middle, right? That's the concept. Sometimes called the midlife squeeze. I have written sometimes called the midlife squeeze. I don't know who calls it that, but that it's often referred to as the sandwich generation. You may be helping growing children while also supporting aging parents, and this idea of, well, it's a developmental pressure on that period of your life that's relatively unique. You don't have that at another stage. Okay. The idea, yeah, the person sometimes is often under pressure, or I say there must shoulder responsibility for maintaining affectional bonds. Like they're trying to like. There's also tons of pressure on. So think of what that means. Like, what are affectional bonds? Like keeping like the quality of relationship positive, and resisting and fighting against things getting negative with both like potentially the aging parents who might be dealing with stuff, and you're trying to keep things positive in that sense in relation to like maybe health concerns or whatever, and then with the kid, whatever like situations they're dealing with, and you're trying to like not get. And that's the big thing, is you're trying to like not get jaded and bitter, and that's like two of the biggest goals in life, is to not get jaded and bitter, because things happen and they can be upsetting, and it's like it's important for the people that depend on you that you can fight through getting jaded and bitter, and so that you can take care of the people that need you, that you love, right? And between the age of 40 and 65, because the thing is all that responsibility that sounds like responsibility, it's also meaning. It's like that's what gives your life meaning. It's not empty responsibility. It's like it's meaning filled responsibility. Between 40 and 65, adults statistically tend to give more help in both directions, right? Which is kind of what I'm saying. Like they're getting less help from anybody, and they're giving more in both directions, right? In terms of resources, I'm talking about. Okay, the total number of friends tends to be less in middle adulthood than earlier in life, and it makes sense, right? It's like you, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a less reduction in quality. And even though people like a lot of my buddies, I see them less frequently, obviously, but it's not like the quality of our relationship is worse. It's actually in some ways better, and it's like a treat to see them, right? And we understand that there's an understanding that the reason we haven't seen each other for a while isn't because like we don't want to hang out. It's because we're super busy. We have our own things, our own families, or whatever. And um, so what I'm saying, it's an interesting thing to look at psychologically, because friendships still matter. The fact that I like to have euchre night with the buddies, or like even just watching Raptors or whatever. It's that kind of stuff is still psychologically significant, even if it's less frequent. Friendships tend to endure even with less frequent content, with less frequent contact, even, right? And it's like, and it goes back to that point I was kind of saying, is it's different than in high school, where if you didn't hang out for like weeks, it's like almost means you're not friends anymore, because it's like, well, you're seeing people every day, so it's like a totally different social world than when you're in your 40s and you're working every day, and it's like you're not really hanging out much, and it's like I'm making it sound so brutal, but I don't know, you get into your rhythm. It's like there's a nice thing about having the people that kind of are still in your social world, are the people that are sort of meant for you, right? They're your actual friends that you want to spend time with, and then your family becomes aspect of that, and then if you get married, then like the extended family becomes an aspect of that. So it's like friendship's still a key variable, even though it's not as developmentally kind of central as it is in, say, for example, the teen years or in like the early childhood years. I hope you're enjoying the class. I've said that a bunch of times throughout the class, but um, you might find the end of this course a little more philosophical or ranty, or like, and I mean, hopefully ranty in a good way. Like, what I'm trying to do is get off note a bit because early in the course, when we're talking about these like key developmental stages, it's really technical. But as we get into later life, it gets this reflective psychological, like existential aspect where a lot of it is like your own questioning of yourself, and it's like really difficult to measure, and it's difficult to quantify, and it's difficult to make like generalizations that are true to everybody. But it's undeniable that there's an aspect of evaluating what you're doing with everything, and being almost hyper aware of again meaning, if things matter. And it's not like we can, everybody's necessarily even articulating that, but what the idea from Erickson is that it's not like everyone's walking around and saying like the reason I'm upset is because I lack purpose and meaning, but it's manifesting in all kinds of different ways. But if you can get deep enough that that's at the core. um empty nest, I'll switch to the topic of the slide. So, but this is another part of it, right? Like if you think of the idea of the nest, this is obviously a metaphor of a bird, and the babies leaving the nest. Nesting is an interesting thing, right? When a lot of mammals are at late stages of pregnancy, there's this like tendency to like nest, right? Or this tendency to, and the human equivalent of it is really interesting. Is it would be maybe like getting the baby's room ready, and it's like it makes sense that there's this motivational urge within the mother and the father to like prepare. It's just, it makes complete developmental evolutionary sense. Actually, it makes evolutionary sense. And so because mothers that did that were probably more likely to have a baby that survives, that at least logically makes consistency sense. um, but in this sense, it's talking about when kids are older and move out. And oftentimes when you ask people about that, like moms about that, they refer to that as a relatively positive thing, right? Like obviously they miss their kid and stuff, but there's something about getting an aspect of their freedom back, right? It's like I love my kids, but for me it's hard to visualize, right? Because one of my kids is only one, my other kid's 6, so like the idea of being an empty nester for me is probably like 20 years away at the least. So I can kind of picture it easier when I picture my own parents. And there's like an aspect of like when me and my brother and sister were moved out, then they could like they traveled more and they've traveled more and like stuff like that, and they love seeing the kids and the grandkids and everything. But they're doing their own life and they have their own personality, and you know and obviously we know this, but from our subjective interpretation of the world, we don't always think of it that way. um, there's this like phenomena of boomeranging or adolescence. Sometimes people use that term in the literature, not in common speech really, but in the literature, just this idea of like people coming, uh, and it makes sense, right? Like I even did it myself back in the day, where I was like, I went to university and then I worked for a bit, and when I was working for a bit, I had a place, and then when I went back to school, I like moved back with the folks for a bit, and then eventually like then I got married and got our place and stuff. But like that back and forth, especially in the economic times of today, like if you're living with your folks for financial reasons, to me that makes like complete sense. Some of you aren't, obviously, you're in a variety of situations, but you can see how situations that would how that would exist in all kinds of scenarios. Young adults are often also now marrying later, having kids later, staying in school longer. So all these things are pushing this empty nest time back, right? People are staying in their house like later into their mid-20s, into their late 20s, into their 30s. And that puts like additional pressure on the parents. And even if they like completely love the kids and completely love having them there, some of the pressures are like financial, and some of the pressures are just like, well, largely financial. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting, right? So I'm going to talk now for a while about grandparenting. That this is a new role for, especially as you're starting to get into this middle age and later into the middle age. Well, obviously depending on when and if you have kids, but this becomes like a new thing, right? That your kids can have kids, and then your kids can also marry, and it introduces like this new aspect to family of in-laws, which I've been lucky that I get along well with the in-laws, and that has been like a huge new aspect or addition to my social world. And for a lot of people, they maybe become grandparents for the first time, and I say that most grandparents report having high levels of satisfaction with this role. And I'm going to talk about different types of ways that grandparents engage, right? Different ways we could classify grandparents' relationships with their grandkids over the next few slides. But it's in general, most grandparents express this as a part of their life that is an enjoyable part, regardless of the fact that obviously grandparents in different situations are engaged very differently in like frequency and how often, and how much they're playing a role in the actual day-to-day care, basically. Grandparents can have a hugely positive influence on a child's development. I put that in especially true in situations where there's a divorce or any kind of trauma or stress on, uh, like special or extra stress on the family, right? And it's like one of the ways that I would think of that is, even in my situation, like me and my wife are not divorced, like we're together, and when we had Evelyn, our first kid, I remember it was like pretty overwhelming in like the first couple nights. And she was up a lot and crying a lot, and I remember on like maybe like my mom had come and seen her already and stuff, but on like the third day my mom came and stayed in the guest room and like had Evelyn in with her, and me and my wife got to like sleep. And I remember like then we got up the next day, and it's like you feel like you're like alive again, because it's sleep deprivation is a funny thing. And the point I'm ranting about here is just that idea of my mom helping that little bit, of a buffer is like so huge. And that's just one of like a million ways that having like another adult that cares about the kid involved in their life, that's like a grandparent or whatever, is like such a developmental advantage if that's a positive relationship. And I'll just show you. This is a picture of my mom, maybe 6 years ago. No, I guess Bennett would be. This is actually like almost 10 years ago, getting close to 10 years ago. And that's my oldest nephew on my side of the family, not my wife's side. And this is my sister's oldest kid, Bennett, when he was a baby. And the reason I'm showing this picture is because this is also when my mom was going through her treatments for breast cancer. And before Bennett was born, she was having like a pretty rough time with health and stuff like that. And the point I was going to make here is how it like, even though I was making the point before that like grandparents can have a huge developmental impact in a positive way on their grandkids, grandkids can also have a huge impact on the psychological health of the grandparent. And I think when Bennett was born, it really helped my mom kind of not just view herself as like as a patient, but also as a grandmother. And then that grandmother, for the first time, this was for the first time, right? This is her oldest grandkid. And now that's a part of her identity. That's a part of her world. That's something she's looking forward to. That's something that's special to her. And this kind of links to what I was saying before about the idea of like purpose and hope and meaning being associated with longevity, actually like having physical influence on health. Okay, if I can have you to kind of note this typology, right? So I'm going to give you, when we say like there's this type of grandparents, or there's this type of grandparents, or there's this type of personality, and this type of personality, and this type of parenting style, and this type of child temperament, and, right? Those are all typologies. So, some grandparents we would call like the literature calls like a remote relationship. See their grandchildren not that much, don't have as much influence on their development. Usually, the reason for a remote relationship, when you ask the grandparent, is they usually say like physical distance, and that makes sense, right? Maybe they don't live close to their grandkids, and that's why they might like have a positive relationship, but they just don't see them as much. And since they don't see them as much, it makes sense that they would have less direct influence on their development. So that's about like 30% roughly of grandparent relationships. Okay, so that would be the first category, right? Remote. Which, just to think about what a remote is, right? Like I can turn the TV on with a remote. I can change the light with a remote. It's like what's interesting about a remote is it can cover distance, right? Like so. Anyways, you know what the word remote means. We can move on to the next slide. Sorry. Okay, so we to make the stats work, we're saying like just over half. So I said before 20%, or no, 30% almost, and then roughly 20% on what we would call involved relationships, and then the other like half or a bit more than a half or what we'd call like companion relationships, right? This is the most commonly cited type of relationship that grandparents, remember, this is like asking them to describe their relationship, right? And then classifying it based on like basically frequency of involvement and amount of engagement with the kid. And about half would be reported as a companionship relationship. Warm, pleasurable relationship, good quality, but also I have that part, like also glad that they don't have kind of the day-to-day responsibilities, right? And you'll even hear grandparents say that if they're being honest, that they like love spending time with the kids, or my mom will like take care of my kids uh, for the day or whatever, and then take care of maybe my brother's kids, and then I'm sure the days that she doesn't have any kids and gets to relax a bit, she enjoys that too. But she wouldn't want that every day. Like she finds it rewarding. But my point is like it's nice to not have to do it every day, right? Not have to get up every night. Um, and then about 16%, yeah, or roughly 16% report being in what would be like an involved relationship where they're more everyday participants in the kid's life. So I'd say like my wife's mom was sort of like that, especially with my oldest, because when she was growing up, she was going to my wife's mom like almost every day, right? She'd go to my mom one day a week, and my wife's sister one day a week, but then 3 days a week, every week, she was with her grandma. And now she's like going to school and stuff, right? So she's not doing that. But so sometimes, depending on the age of the kid and the kind of the state of the family dynamic or whatever, it can switch at different times. The typology can switch, but I think you get what I'm kind of trying to say here. But yeah, so it'd be like more involved. This might be even in a situation where it's like a multi-generational household where like the grandparents actually living with the family, and providing nearly full-time care, right? But living with the family, sort of, right? And the reason I said that again is because I'm gonna compare it on the next slide. I'm gonna give the term like custodial grandparent, like where they're the actual legal guardian, whereas in the involved relationship, it's still kind of the idea that they're supporting the primary family or the parents. Okay, so as I kind of alluded to, this idea that the last one, custodial grandparenting, so this would be when um, the kid's living with the grandparent as the main guardian. Oftentimes, it's so I say there like statistically, it's oftentimes when um, the mother is unmarried, and either for in positive scenarios, maybe she's going back to work or like to upgrade career, or is working a lot and not able to take care of the kid, or she's like going back to school, or it can be obviously like negative scenarios where maybe mom's struggling with a whole list of potential issues and isn't able to care for the child. This would be an interesting thing to talk to you about this next point, if we were doing this course live, that this idea of kind of the idea in our mind of what a grandmother is tends to be a bit more broad than our idea of what a grandfather is. And both my grandparents, both my grandfathers were kind of like, they're both like farmers that were in World War II vets that were like, what's the word I'm looking for? I have like a specific idea of them, and then I guess my relationship with my grandma was more like rounded and more multi-dimensional in some ways. But yeah, it'd be interesting to discuss like why is that the case, right? And as my grandpa Walsh, like my mom's dad, stayed alive a lot longer. Like he just passed like very very recently, and like in right before Christmas, and as he got older, he started to like kind of get more emotional and more like talking about stuff like that. And so I'd say like how I related to him, that expanded a bit. But yeah, it's an interesting like I'd be interested to hear what you thought about it. Um, for most adults in middle age, being a grandparent though, even though they view it as very important, it's not the main way they define themselves. On this point, I wanted to tell this story that I remember when my grandma. So I just said that my grandpa passed, but then like his wife, who was my grandma Walsh, who was like one of my favorite people ever. I remember when she passed and we were like looking through some of her stuff, and I remember coming across that the information in a yearbook that in high school she was like a really good basketball player, and that people were like commenting on her basketball skills, and I remember being like, I can't believe this, like my grandma played basketball first of all. Like I'm like I love the Raptors, and I like didn't even know that that was like part of who she was, and that like during her high school time, that's like what people thought of when they thought of her, and it was like such a mind-blowing thing to me because like obviously like when we're kids looking at our grandparents, they're always like an older person, and it takes like some real reflection to kind of think of how they went through their life in a subjective experience way very similar to how you do. I hope that rant made some sense. Okay. Okay, there's a few more topics I want to talk about in this presentation. I want to talk a little bit about caring for aging parents, and this term I want one term for you to know is this idea of filial responsibility, or this kind of feeling that people have. It's just putting a word to the sense that people have of wanting to take care of their parents, and some of the responsibility or obligation they feel to do that. And again, I want to responsibility and obligation sound almost like they're negative words, but my point is that like some of the most meaningful things that you'll do in your life come to you in the disguise of responsibilities, right? It's like, anyways, I've made points like that a couple times today. I don't know why I'm all about that concept today, but right, that parents are symbolically important as elders, and I like the word elders a lot better than some of the words like even like senior citizen or whatever. It's like, or elderly. It's like, what about just elder? There's something about elderly that, I don't know, steals from the word a bit. It's like, not really, not like linguistically, but just in how we use it as a culture, right? Because when you think of an elder, there's almost like a respected wisdom aspect of it. And I think like we're missing a lot in the West in how we treat the older people, because like for a lot of human evolution and for a lot of human uh, civilization, like the older people were hugely important in raising the young. And we've almost like completely, except for within families, which would be the scenario obviously where it makes the most sense. We sometimes don't remember that enough. Right? Like it's like your worth isn't just your earning potential. And I think like yeah, how we understand the aging population is super important. It's super important in Canada because we have a very graying, they say like graying or like aging population, and that's gonna be something I'm gonna talk about more next time. But and then the next thing, okay, so caregivers. Well, here's the thing. It's like if say your parent is sick and you're taking care of them, and then you know you're working all day and then you're going and taking care of your parent and then you're coming home and it's like 8:30 and you know you weren't home for supper and your spouse had to put the kids to bed and they're a bit upset but they know that you're like trying to do it, so everyone's like trying to be like cool about everything, but it's straining, right? It's not surprising that that caregiver burden is associated with things like marital strain and like and just depression overall, right? Like that it's like it's just draining, even if it's the right thing to do, even if it's what you need to do. And so that's why one of the things that really helps for people going through caregiver burden is more than even in other situations, because in a lot of situations that you're going through, sitting around with other people and sort of complaining or telling, not necessarily complaining, but like sharing your experience and complaining about certain aspects of it, it's like you wouldn't always encourage that. There's some scenarios where that's not necessarily what the person necessarily needs, but the research on this is kind of interesting that for people going through caregiver burden, sometimes that is like super therapeutic to be able to, because it feels like such an alone experience that hearing other people going through the same thing, even if it's a bit complainy, it's like, well, that kind of sounds like me too. And it's like that normalizing of that experience can be helpful. It's because oftentimes the thing is that what's hard for the person that's experiencing caregiver burden is the fact that they're like doing so much stuff, right? And it's like to stop that burden, you'd have to almost stop doing that. And if it's like your aging parent and you don't want to stop taking care of them, then part of it is dealing with that stress, right? And one way of getting rid of some of it is like talking about it or like, and that's how you can like support people dealing with caregiver burden is realizing that a lot of what they're holding is like emotional, right? And that like processing some of that is some of the best favor you can do for them because you're helping them like restore their gas tank or whatever so that they can keep doing what they need to do. And if you look at this picture, like I put, notice the love and the exhaustion, right? Like you can read into this picture a bit, right? And you could say like, okay, this could be a scenario where let's say the woman on the left has been working all day at her job, right? She maybe got up in the morning, helped the kids get off to high school, and then like went to work, and then after work had to drive to where her mom lives, which is maybe like 20 minutes away in the nearby town. I'm obviously making this up. Gets there, like spends time with her mom. You can tell like the mom's like she's hugging her mom, but she's also like looking tired, and the mom's like looking off. Maybe the mom's experiencing dementia, and maybe the mom's not even recognizing the daughter. Like it's like depending on how far things have progressed, and it's like the complexity is, you know, because this manifests in a million different ways and people in a million different situations. And again, just that point of notice the love and exhaustion. They're both present at the same time. Just a couple more interesting things about uh, this topic of caring for aging parents. Oftentimes, the people caring for their aging parents don't have kids at home, and that kind of makes sense, right? Like, say if me and my brother and sister if one of our parents were sick and one of us had like a new baby, it would make sense that the person that had the new baby would be like maybe helping less, or maybe some of us live closer or whatever. But the idea is that usually it's siblings, it's like children that don't have young kids. But it's really interesting to note that about 90% of the caregivers for people that have Alzheimer's that are like the children are either the daughter or the daughter-in-law. So it definitely skews heavily female in terms of who's actually providing the care statistically. And then this point that I kind of had already mentioned, that intervention or helping can help ease caregiver burden by providing like information and resources and encouragement and support and that kind of stuff. Because again, the point is that it can be a very isolating experience, and like kind of doing all that work, some of the resources provided can be like, how to work through some of the how to work through some of maybe the marriage complications, and how to deal with maybe some of the power of attorney and some of like the actual legal stuff of having like a parent getting closer to end of life. And it's sometimes getting practical help and then also being able to talk about it and get things off your chest. It's like those two things together can be really helpful for preventing burnout. Because think of what burnout is, right? Burnout is basically this idea that, and technically what burnout is that your like anxiety levels or your stress hormones are high above for a long time, right? And instead of normalizing, they dip below, right? And so they burn out is the idea, right? That they drop to a hypo level, not a hyper level. That wasn't the great. I freestyled that explanation, but that's actually true. Okay. So I want to just talk for a sec here about Alzheimer's disease, and there's only a couple slides left. I'm going to talk a little bit about Alzheimer's disease, kind of what it is, and then I have a video at the end that I think you'll find kind of interesting, and let's hope YouTube lets me leave it in. But the video, I think, shows a really interesting, like it's one of these science animations. I think it does a really good job at showing what Alzheimer's is and also how Alzheimer's might be eventually cured, right? And that the cure is probably going to be at the level of genetics. And Alzheimer's can be such a devastating thing, right? Because of the way that it attacks. It's obviously part of, it's considered a degenerative condition, right? But how it affects the individual and how it can be linked to affecting their memory. And you really see when people start to lose their memory how much their whole life story, this life story I was talking about earlier, lives in your memory, right? It's you remember that story, and when you start to forget that story, you almost start to forget who you are, and you start to forget who other people are and what and that's actually terrifying, because like part of your sense of who you are and who you are in your world is based on how you're making sense of, I'm kind of stumbling with how I'm saying this, but how you're making sense of yourself and other people and how you stand in relationships in them. And as you start to forget those relationships, the ground you're standing on becomes less stable. It's like that, the grandma looking into like maybe her grandson or maybe her son's face and not recognizing it. Okay, so here, we'll put this all up. So Alzheimer's. So Alzheimer's is somebody's last name, right? So this Dr. Alzheimer found that there were these like plaque deposits. You'll hear the word, I have it down there somewhere. Yeah, plaques, these like dense deposits of proteins in the blood vessels. And that these amyloids were causing it, these amyloid plaques. So I'll start at the beginning here. Alzheimer's disease is progressive, meaning it's like it keeps moving forward. Irreversible, meaning we don't know a way to make it backtrack. Brain disorder characterized by this gradual deterioration or breakdown of memory, reasoning, language, and eventually even physical functioning. So, as devastating as it could be, your memory, your ability to reason, to like think things through and problem solve and make decisions, your ability to speak and understand language, and eventually even your physical functioning. It's the most common type of dementia. Once destruction of the brain tissue occurs from Alzheimer's disease, it's unlikely that treatment of the disease could ever reverse that, especially like this is obviously based on our kind of current understanding, 2023. Deterioration characterized by the formation of these amyloid plaques, these dense deposits of protein in the blood vessels, and neurofibrillary tangles. Think of that's a $100 word, but like that's like your brain fiber tangles. So that just means like the brain fibers, basically these twisted fibers built in the neurons that have this protein called tau, T-A-U. The video I'm going to show you is related to that, and I'm kind of trying to highlight this to you because I think this is going to be like a word you might see again, especially in relation to if they ever cure Alzheimer's, that it'll be their ability to figure out what exactly this tau protein is doing. The video I'm going to show is going to kind of explain that idea further. Okay, so just before I show you the video, this first photo shows you a slice of a normal aging brain. Okay, this next photo shows you a slice of a brain that's being ravaged by Alzheimer's. Right, you can note the deterioration and the shrinking in the Alzheimer's diseased brain. This next video, though, I think you're gonna find it interesting, and it's gonna show you like where there's actually some room to be hopeful on the idea that we might actually crack this as humans. We might be able to figure out, you know, what it is in the brain that's actually physically changing between someone that we would call having Alzheimer's and someone that doesn't yet have it, and how it might actually be related to the breakdown of this tau protein. All right, this chapter or this presentation 11 is going to be related to quiz 3, which will be up by the time you see this, and again, same idea as the other ones. And thanks for watching. I'm probably not going to, I'll just let the video play out, and this will be my last slide, but I'll see you soon and in the next presentation, chapter 12. And thanks for everything. I hope you have a great week. Thanks for being such awesome students, and I hope you enjoy this next video. Cheers, my friends.
Over a century ago, a German doctor called Alois Alzheimer spotted anomalies in brain sections from a patient with dementia. Ever since, people have been studying the strange plaques and tangles that he saw, in the hope that we could one day understand and cure what is now known as Alzheimer's disease. Plaques are insoluble deposits of a peptide called amyloid beta, or A-beta. They're formed when a protein called amyloid precursor protein is sequentially cleaved by two enzymes, beta and gamma secretase. Other molecules are generated by this cleavage and may play a role in the disease, but A-beta is the main culprit. A-beta tends to misfold and become sticky, eventually clumping together to form soluble oligomers. Some of these aggregate into large insoluble fibrils that deposit in the brain as plaques. The oligomers come in several forms or species. We don't know exactly which species are toxic, but research shows that they weaken communication and plasticity at synapses. This could be what stops the brain from forming or retrieving memories. Neurons aren't the only cells affected in Alzheimer's disease. Astrocytes and microglia also play a role. Microglia are immune cells that clear out waste and prune synapses during development. Microglia take up A-beta, but they also get activated by it, triggering the release of inflammatory cytokines that can damage neurons. The microglia also start to remove synapses by phagocytosis. As synapses start to malfunction and neurons die, abnormal patterns of activity emerge, and eventually the brain can't process and store information properly. Another key feature of Alzheimer's disease is neurodegeneration. Neuronal death and damage is triggered by A-beta, but some of A-beta's effects seem to be mediated by another protein seen in the brains of patients, tau, a component of tangles. In a healthy neuron, molecules are carried along the axon on a series of tracks, made of microtubules and stabilised by tau. But in Alzheimer's disease, tau is modified, causing it to dissociate from the microtubules, adopt an abnormal shape, and move from the axon to the cell body. Like A-beta, tau comes in a variety of forms, and we don't know which ones contribute to the disease. And like A-beta, these forms either remain soluble or stick together and deposit as the tangles that Dr. Alzheimer saw. Eventually, these processes kill the neuron. Another problem, seen in animal models, is that misfolded tau proteins can spread across synapses into healthy neurons. There, they make healthy tau proteins start to misfold as well, spreading pathology across the brain. The pattern of spreading through the different brain regions matches the changing symptoms from early to late stages of Alzheimer's disease. This pattern also reflects how certain neurons are more vulnerable than others to dying. Despite these advances in our understanding of Alzheimer's disease, no cure exists. While drugs are being developed to target amyloid beta or tau, it's unclear whether they will eventually be successful in treating the disease. There's only one certainty. Continued support for basic and clinical research will enable us, one day, to diagnose and treat this devastating condition.